Okay, if I can have your attention, welcome to the workshop Final Briefings summer semester of 2021. During this summer, we've been starting to look at the science of bioenvironmental pieces of legislation and communicating it. And part of what we do in this workshop is what's called learning by doing. We're thinking through and working together to learn about these issues and to learn how to communicate them and to think about them. And so that's part of our exercise. I think everybody here, if you think about the bills and what you knew about them that first Wednesday after Memorial Day and what you know about them today, I think it's pretty obvious this is a pretty good way to learn about these things. And I think by the end of these 5 presentations, everybody will see the excellence and professionals of our students, which is you, as we learn about these programs. Next semester, we're going to actually try to figure out how to put them into place. So we're going to start with Deanna Coleman and the Environmental Justice Mapping and Data Collection Act of 2021. And our first presentation of the group provided by Mr. Rosen. So let's get started.
Can people hear me? Yeah. And then should we change it that way? Okay. Hi everyone. Today I'll be talking about HR 516, the Environmental Justice and Mapping and Data Collection Act of 2021. I'd like to thank each individual in our workshop for their efficient and enthusiastic work that has brought us to our final output today, as well as our faculty advisor, Professor Rosen. Today, we'll take you through the mechanics behind our bill, from the definition of environmental justice to our key metrics of success. First, we need to understand the key assumptions behind this bill. Environmental justice, as defined by the bill, is a community with significant representation of communities of color, low-income communities, or tribal and low-income communities or tribal and indigenous communities that experiences or is at risk of experiencing higher or more adverse human health or environmental effects as compared to other communities. Environmental justice has been an issue for millennia, with the modern movement beginning in the 1960s and gaining momentum in the 1980s, with the linkage between environmental hazards and race becoming apparent. The graph on the right here illustrates the disproportionate exposure to pollution faced by communities of color in the United States, where Black and Latinx communities experience more pollution than they produce. This bill seeks to ensure that everyone, regardless of race and class, is protected from environmental hazards and involved in the environmental policy-making process. This bill has a 3-pronged approach. The first is the creation of a committee, which will include representatives from 28 different federal agencies, as well as community, indigenous, and tribal leaders. The committee will be led by the EPA, but will also have members from federal agencies, including the Departments of Health and Human Services, Commerce, and Justice. A centralized data repository will allow each federal agency to contribute unique data to build on this map. The data will focus on indicators of demographics, public health, and environmental hazards. The committee will then create a multi-layered map, which will be used to identify EJ communities. The map will be constructed using Geographic Information System Mapping, GIS, which I'll illustrate in a minute. And third, we have funding. The bill will appropriate $94 million over the course of 5 years to cover the costs to form the committee, establish and maintain a data repository, and construct the map. In allocating appropriate funding to these agencies and stakeholders to carry out this work, the identification of EJ communities enables these communities to to access relevant investment, for example, President Biden's Justice 40 initiative. These three mandates, the committee, the mapping, and the funding, are included in this bill because combined, they will develop a data repository that will be accessible to all relevant stakeholders at all levels. Whether rural or urban, EJ communities are prevalent across the whole country, with race, income level, and political influence being reported as the strongest indicators. With nearly 34 million people living below the poverty line in the US, low-income communities often lack access to adequate infrastructure, like medical attention, to combat these environmental hazards. They also generally lack the political influence to change these circumstances, with 23% of Congress made up of people of color compared to 40% of the United States. To better understand the specific health impacts of the EJ communities face from environmental hazards, which range from climate change to various sources of pollution, I will discuss three common hazards. The first is water pollution, for example, which can come from the presence of lead in drinking water and can cause behavioral issues, lower IQ levels, learning disabilities, and many other issues. The same can be said for particulate matter, nitrogen oxide, and sulfur dioxide, which can come from inhalation or exposure to acid rain or smog, both of which lead to various diseases related to your lungs. I will be referring to Flint, Michigan throughout the remainder of my presentation to illustrate how the layering of various social, political, and environmental issues result in environmental injustice. Flint, a city in eastern Michigan, made headlines in 2015 because of a quick fix in a water source that resulted in Flint's water becoming contaminated with lead. In a sample of 300 residents, 10% reported elevated blood lead levels, 50% had skin rashes, and 40% experienced further symptoms like hair loss. Even though water quality has been an issue in Flint since the 1960s, the city struggled to rectify their water issues for two main reasons. 43% of its community live below the poverty line, and they are predominantly people of color. Therefore, they lack the means necessary to combat the institutional obstacles preventing them from obtaining adequate drinking water. Given these factors, Flint illustrates the potential benefits that H.R. 516 could provide to these types of communities. Cases like Flint exist all across the country. It's very uncommon that EJ communities are ever combating a single issue, but are rather plagued by multiple. As I mentioned before, mapping tools already exist. There are 7 at a federal level and 5 at a state level, but each is created for a separate purpose, and so bringing them together is seldom possible. I can exemplify this further through Flint. Here we have 3 maps. The first is by the EPA, and it looks at water quality in Flint. The second is by the CDC and explores health and disease-related data. And the third is by the Michigan government that looks at demographic and census data. As you can see, there is different data, different temporal and spatial scales. Different agencies use different data collection methods, yet all of these maps are of Flint, exemplifying the same problem. More importantly, the community at the time did not have access to these maps that could have helped empower them. So how can HR 516 fix this? If the proposed solution was ready, it would have looked somewhat like this for Flint. Here we have a series of layers. The base map, which is our geographic location of Flint, impaired water bodies and streams, represented by the green dots, which I don't know if it's clear, is representative of the public and subsidized housing, which often suggests the low-income communities. And then we have risk screen environmental indicators and hazardous risk sites. Had these layers been brought together in 2015 during the crisis, it would have looked somewhat like this, and it would have served as a reactive purpose. The government would have been able to respond faster. They would have been able to identify which areas were being harmed by lead poisoning, and the transparency of the data would have allowed Flint residents to track the issue themselves. Ultimately, the bill's mapping tool could have also served as a predictive tool with future investment and investigation. Our proposed solution does have obstacles to tackle. Vagueness in the definition of an EJ community makes it challenging to clearly identify and measure environmental injustice. Additionally, some communities, for example, those with undocumented residents, are wary of government engagement. This can often lead to issues of identification, accessibility, coverage, lack and inconsistency of collection of data and the creation of the map. Likewise, the people behind it, as with any bill, may try to influence its outcome. Stakeholder interests can favor a certain group identification over another, and the politics of politics could alter the allocation of funds. HR 516 addresses limitations by incorporating methods of success at every stage of the process, from community outreach to the committee members. The committee will be successful if there is a diverse array of communities that are supposed to be incorporated and they are adequately represented, whereby monitored collaboration is vital. The map will also be successful if it is able to clearly identify EJ communities so that they can be connected to the relevant investment. And at the same time, success will also be measured through an increase in funding to the committee to enable them to work beyond 5 years, and also increase the investment opportunities available for these EJ communities. But measuring success is not solely limited to the committee, the mapping, and the funding of the bill. Success in a bill, especially related to people, is relative. And unfortunately, in the case of Flint, it can be difficult and sometimes impossible to fully achieve. With the state of Michigan arriving at a $640 million settlement, and the CDC and the EPA well underway in their infrastructure improvements, the response to Flint is being marked as a success. But for the people of Flint, it isn't a time to celebrate. When asked about the recent settlement, a mother from Flint responded, "My son and my daughter are poisoned for the rest of their lives. It is irreversible. It's like the damage has already been done, but I guess it's a win." And it's not just Flint. There are many areas across the country where this is a salient or an unidentified issue. HR 516 seeks to address the issues that communities like Flint face across the country. This bill aims to improve the quality of life for marginalized communities and achieve environmental justice. Thank you, and do you have any questions?
Good job. Good job, amazing presentation. I had a quick question. Would you happen to know where the Congress of bill is currently at in this stage?
Yeah, so the Committee of Energy and Commerce have just passed it on to the Subcommittee of Environment and Climate Change in February 2021, so it'll probably still be sitting there for a while.
Other questions?
Great presentation. I really like this speed of movies. But I remember in one slide you showed there's 26 federal agencies and individual stakeholders in the committee. So as you pointed out, there's a lot of challenge among the stakeholder conflicts. Is there any solution addressing that?
Yeah, so there's 28 federal agencies. We've not looked into how they are going to collaborate to work together. I'm pretty sure that is an issue that we're going to address next semester.
Take one more. Over here.
In terms of where the funding is going to actually be going, you mentioned that goes to the committee, but is it to collect more data, or is it to basically amalgamate and standardize, like scattered and disparate data?
I think it will depend on the agencies involved, but generally it will be kind of a combination of both, building on what's already there, potentially with the history, but then moving forward, it will be a collection of the same data.
Thank you. Excellent. Wonderful start. I think what we're going to do is go directly to our second presentation. Take a break after that. So The second presentation is on the Climate Stewardship Act of 2021, which Professor Palmer has been working with the group on, and our presenter is Samantha Lang. So if you're ready, come forward.
Everyone hear me? Good morning, everyone. My name is Sam Lang, and today I will be presenting the final briefing for the Climate Stewardship Act. Before I get started, I'd like to thank my team of Jasmine, Nikki, and Mia, as well as the rest of our group for all of their hard work throughout the semester, and Dr. Palmer for all of his help. Our nation's farms, forests, and wetlands are suffering from mismanagement and the effects of climate change. Our country faces reduced crop yields, catastrophic fires, worsening coastal flooding, and all of these produce carbon emissions, which then exacerbate the problems occurring within each ecosystem. The photo on the left is of a farm outside of Los Angeles that was farmed extractively for 50 years. It was a monoculture farm that used agricultural practices ill-suited for the environment, and the soil was almost completely unproductive for farming without huge amounts of fertilizer. This is one of the many farms in the United States that has deteriorated their soils and the environment with certain agricultural management practices. This is a photo of the King Fire, which in 2014 burned 100,000 acres of the El Dorado National Forest in California. Decades of mismanaged forest fires in California, particularly through fire suppression, led to a buildup of vegetation, which now under hotter, drier conditions, acts as fuel for fire and releases huge amounts of carbon when burned. This combination of anthropogenic factors and a changing climate have led to these massive forest fires that we've seen out west for the last decade or so. Wetlands have the capacity to store vast amounts of carbon and to buffer coastal communities from climate change effects, such as storm surges and flooding. But due to the poor management and the effects of climate change, wetlands are storing less carbon, emitting carbon at higher than natural rates, and are ineffectively buffering coastal communities from these floods. In summary, the way we manage these systems in the US has shifted what were once resilient carbon sinks to be net carbon emitters, thus contributing to climate change. When people think about climate change, they tend to think of tailpipes and smokestacks, but these natural systems play a role as well. In response to these issues, the Climate Stewardship Act presents innovative environmental and economic measures that restore these ecosystems and their carbon sequestering abilities, aim to mitigate climate change and improve climate resilience, as well as promote social equity. The Climate Stewardship Act addresses these issues in 3 titles, each one focused on one of the land uses. Title 1 starts with agriculture. Title I expands existing programs and creates new programs by providing funding that scales up every year until 2030. The total funding increase will equate to tens of billions of dollars and will help provide incentives, technical assistance, and assist farmers in purchasing equipment in order to further these climate stewardship goals. The title defines 38 specific climate stewardship practices with climate resilience and mitigation as a focus for each. The bill also expands allotted land acreage and program life for existing agricultural programs and reserves 5% of funding for low-income and minority producers, as well as first-time farmers. The bill supports practices like these listed on the screen that meet their definition of climate stewardship, which is any effective vegetative or management practice that reduces greenhouse gas emissions, increases carbon sequestration, or assists producers in adapting to or mitigating against the effects of climate change. Let's look at a case study to see how this can be applied in farming. So if you remember that first photo of the lifeless soil that was unproductive for agriculture, this is what that same farm looks like after the incorporation of climate stewardship practices. So these photos are from APRICOT Lane Farm, an example of a farm that has built up resilience to increase drought conditions and climatic changes. You may recognize this if you've ever seen the Hulu documentary, Biggest Little Farm. APRICOT Lane uses many of the climate stewardship practices listed in the bill, including crop rotation, grazing rotation, pollinator habitat establishment, compost application, and cover cropping. These practices work to store carbon in the soil, increase nutrient and water content, and grow 200 varieties of fruits and vegetables. Some things to consider moving forward is that these results may not replicate the same everywhere due to climatic variations, and the types and number of practices implemented can yield different outcomes. So the goal here would be to use intentional localized planning with federal assistance when carrying out these climate stewardship practices within agriculture. Title II covers forestry. So Title II focuses on reforestation in order to increase carbon sequestration and decrease emissions from forests. To achieve these goals, the Climate Stewardship Act proposes major increases in funding. The Reforestation Trust Fund will go from $30 million of funding to $5.5 billion, which is over an 18,000% increase. And this will fund reforestation work across the United States. Reforestation under this act will take place on both private and public forests, including federal, state, tribal, and municipal land, and will take place on both urban and rural landscapes. The act also outlines the creation of the Conservation Stewardship Corps, which will provide employment within forest management for young people from low-income communities, indigenous communities, and communities of color. The act includes tree planting goals that scale up yearly and equate to 1.7 billion trees planted by 2030. Though most of these will be planted in remote forests, 100 million of them are set to be planted in urban areas, specifically areas that have traditionally been redlined. Reforestation techniques will be backed by climate science and will aim to diversify forests in order to increase resilience and carbon sequestration, and will also reduce soil erosion in order to promote long-term carbon storage. Currently, there are varying studies of sequestration potential, as sequestration in forest depends on many factors, including tree size and biodiversity. So these factors will have to be taken into consideration when planning reforestation efforts moving forward. So if you recall, I mentioned the King Fire from 2014, but informed by new climate science, reforestation efforts are now focused on improving forest resilience and long-term sequestration. Since the fire, thousands of trees have been planted in order to test out a climate resilient design. Specifically, they're using cluster planting, where trees are planted in groups close to water sources in order to better stand up to drought. And also this way, fire cannot as easily spread among the trees. So this is basically to mimic what the forest would look like if we had used prescribed burns as opposed to fire suppression, and is one example of how we can plan out our reforestation practices moving forward. Last, we'll cover wetlands. So the Climate Stewardship Act establishes the Coastal and Estuary Resilience Grant Program to provide funding for coastal wetland restoration. At present, federal funding for wetland restoration is largely distributed by the NOAA National Coastal Resilience Grant Program, which offered $34 million of funding in 2021. The Coastal Estuary Resilience Grant Program allocates $37.5 billion through 2030. This is an average of $4.2 billion per year, which is over a 12,000% increase in annual funding. The Act also provides technical assistance and sets ambitious targets for restoration. It sets out to restore 2.3 billion acres by 2030, which is a 13,000% increase from the almost 18,000 acres, which have been restored by previous federal restoration initiatives. Significantly, this program also prioritizes funding projects that are led by historically marginalized leaders in frontline communities. Wetland mismanagement has resulted in increased climate risks, such as flooding events for surrounding communities, as well as increased carbon emissions from wetlands, when in reality, wetlands can act as very powerful carbon sinks. Wetland restoration practices encouraged by the bill may include revegetation, hydraulic correction, and thin layer sediment placement, all of which improve sediment structure and water dynamics within the wetlands. This Florida Bay mangrove was highly degraded, resulting in mass vegetation losses and resulting erosion. You can see here that the water is really cloudy. This is due to all of the suspended sediment, which should be still attached to the wetland wall. With restoration efforts, the roots of the wetland plants can help increase secretion, which is the buildup of sediment and soil over time, by trapping and holding the sediments in place while simultaneously slowing tidal currents by absorbing wave impacts, thereby reducing erosion. This was observed in a 2017 study of wetland revegetation and accretion in Tampa Bay, Florida, where revegetating coastline with mangrove increased sediment accumulation from 1.5 to 7.2 millimeters per year to 4.2 to 11 millimeters per year. With a sea level rise in that area of 2.6 millimeters per year, revegetation significantly increases the elevation relative to the waterline, reducing the threat of wetland loss to sea level rise. So success in this bill in general will just mean more carbon sequestration and lower emissions from these three land systems. These will be evaluated through some common methods like studying the soil carbon via soil cores, but there are also some system-specific measurements. So while we'll look at soil carbon across all three, within forestry, we will also look at tree cover, and within wetlands, we will also look at accretion rates. So in conclusion, the Climate Stewardship Act presents innovative environmental and economic measures that restore these ecosystems, promote social equity, and engage Americans in climate resilience work. If we can optimize functions within farms, forests, and wetlands, we can ensure each ecosystem's ability to support life and use them as nature-based carbon sequestration mechanisms in the fight against climate change. Thank you all for listening, and with that, I would be happy to take any questions.
Right here.
Fantastic. So anytime you introduce nature into the equation, there's a lot of variables you have to consider, right? And given the speed that we have to sequester carbon, how confident are you that this is the best use of our resources?
Like our time or our money?
Time, money, people, really anything that we would have to throw at this that couldn't be allocated elsewhere.
Yeah, so I think this is a very effective use of our resources. For one thing, these systems already exist. We already have agriculture. We already are meeting reforestation efforts. So to just do so more efficiently and with climate variations in mind, I think is an extremely efficient resource. Additionally, these practices aim to do more than just sequester carbon. They aim to stop forest fires and floods, all of which are incredibly expensive in terms of damages and can be really devastating to communities. So overall, I think it is a very efficient use of our resources.
Other questions? Anybody with that?
For your presentation, I was just curious from your research, looking at the three, if one of them seems to have a lot more potential carbon sequestration than the other ones, if equal.
I think it kind of depends on the way that you're looking at it. So for instance, while wetlands can store a lot of carbon within their soil, they do cover less land area as opposed to forests, which may have slightly less storage potential within the soil, but do just cover a greater space of the country. So it kind of depends on a bunch of different factors.
Thank you.
First, great presentation, Sam. That was really well done. So in terms of the portion of the bill that provides funding to the farmers to more sustainable agricultural practices, I was curious if there are any incentives or methods of promoting that component of the bill, or is it just kind of like a pure cost recovery to farmers that they request that funding?
It's kind of just a cost recovery thing, but at the same time, it's that farmers are now given financial assistance and incentives to incorporate these practices. And also, a lot of farmers do see a lot more promising results using these practices. So in that example that we used, that farm became significantly more productive after implementing these policies. So it's kind of twofold, right? It's that the farm can have healthier soil, which can lead to greater crop use, but or crop production, while they also have that financial assistance from the government.
There's one more.
Forest restoration takes more than decades to overcome, so how do we ensure there's long-term funding? And if there's something happen that requires more funding, how do we ensure it?
Yeah, so the funding does scale up significantly until I believe that's 2030. So that kind of ensures that there will be these goals that are long-term. Beyond the scope of the bill, I can't really speak to what the government's going to do, but hopefully if these forests do prove to be successful in reducing forest fires and emissions, then there will be additional funding to follow.
Okay, another. Let's take 5 minutes break before we start with our third. Okay, 5 minutes. Let's listen to
whole show up. on Zoom. Zoom. Whatever. I can't believe you say that. Bailed me out.
Something that opposite. Yeah, but I mean, they organize it like. Going pretty well. Yeah. Ethan Thomas and Brunch. Gotta talk. Let me ask you on your seat. Yeah. Okay. You have a very eager colleague here. On your seat. And I have to say, I'm very impressed with these briefings. I'm also very impressed this group has taken on our advertising logo for their briefing that night. Folks, thank you. Sorry to interrupt. So our next briefing is on the break free from plastic, advised by Chris Cook. And Max is going to do his presentation.
Hear me?
Yep.
Hello, everybody. My name is Max Lottie, and I've had the pleasure of co-managing Breakthrough from Plastics Pollution Act of 2021 Summer Workshop Group. Before we begin, I want to thank my co-manager, Tessa Owens, as well as the entire team for all their hard work and effort in researching this project. I also want to thank our faculty advisor, Dr. Cook, for all his insights. Before we begin talking about the bill itself, let's first address the plastic problem. Since 1950, over 8.3 billion tons of plastic have been produced. This is because plastics are cheap, easily moldable, sanitary, as well as durable. However, their durable nature means that they can take up to 1,000 years to decompose. As of right now, the US currently lacks a proper grasp on how to deal with plastics end of life cycle. This is because, as seen with only 9% being recycled, which is why this bill is being proposed. The plastic life cycle can be broken up into 7 broad stages, beginning with the extraction of either oil or liquid natural gas, which is then refined and turned into raw plastic nurdles. These nurdles are then molded down into various different products, which are then distributed consumed. It can then be recycled, some can be reused, but the vast majority of which ends up in the landfill as waste. Today we'll discuss the three core components the bill addresses. We will begin by discussing the environmental component. Going back to the beginning of the plastic life cycle, we can see that plastic is either made from oil or liquid natural gas. The vast majority of plastics in the United States is made from liquid natural gas. This is because of the wide availability of natural gas in our large shale rock formations. Natural gas is extracted via hydraulic fracturing, otherwise known as fracking, which is the process of injecting high-pressure liquids and chemicals into rock formations underground, forcing these rocks to excrete oil or gas. Natural gas is also much cheaper to produce because it has less stages necessary in the refinement process. That being said, plastics are one of the main justifications for continuing to extract fossil fuels going into the future. So by addressing the plastics problem, regulators are thus addressing the fossil fuel problem as well. There are two main controversies surrounding fracking. The first of which has to do with their emissions. Natural gas is a much cleaner burning fossil fuel than others, with about a 50% reduction of CO2 emissions as compared to coal. However, when not burned properly, natural gas releases methane into the atmosphere. Methane is about 80 times more potent in a 20-year in its first 20 years in the atmosphere. And that being said, it is really important for us to grab a hold of methane in order to see a reduced warming effect in the coming decades. Methane leakages occur when fracking sites are often abandoned, as well as throughout the extensive pipeline network in the United States, which is often poorly maintained. The second main controversy is around groundwater contamination. Many fracking companies will say groundwater contamination is impossible, as fracking pipes are located well below the groundwater table. While this is true, these pipes are often leak over time. The vast majority of fracking sites are located on indigenous community lands or in low-income rural communities who have little alternatives for water sources. So when the groundwater is contaminated, they are forced to turn to plastic water bottle alternatives. In 1963, at the National Plastic Conference, leaders of the conference claimed that the future of plastics lie within the trash can. This meant that plastic producers should stop producing reusable packaging and start producing single-use plastics, which are meant to be used once and thrown into the landfill. This is because they are cheaper and much more profitable for both the fossil fuel companies and the producers. This has led to mass single-use production as well as mass single-use litter. The bill directly addresses this by banning single-use plastic products such as bags, utensils, and straws by 2023. Its impact would require production companies to produce more reusable, recyclable, and compostable plastic alternatives, and its effectiveness will be measured in the decreased amount of plastic in the waste stream. Another issue leading to plastics in the environment is the often misused recycling symbol. These symbols to the right are not actually recycling symbols at all and are found on every single plastic container. What they are actually resin numbers that denote what types of resin and chemical components are used in the plastic, which is seen in the abbreviation below the symbol. As of now, the only commercially viable recycling types are types 1 and 2. That being said, the bill directly addresses this by creating a national standardized labeling system for recyclable products, which will help better educate the consumers which products should be thrown in the recycling bin and which products should be thrown in the waste bin. This will help improve recycling and waste management habits, as well as will be measured in increased recycling rates. Next, we will look at the public health aspect of the bill. The health risks of plastic stem from either the production phase or during its degradation. When plastics are refined, refinement plants produce hazardous air pollutants and toxic chemicals, which are released into the air and are directly linked to increased cancer and asthma rates in nearby communities. The vast majority of refinement plants are located in predominantly low-income communities of color, such as those in southern Louisiana in the infamously known Cancer Alley. Plastic products are also treated with bisphenol A, otherwise known as BPA, and phthalates to make these products more durable. However, these toxins are known endocrine disruptors, which inhibit or mimic the body's natural hormonal, immunal, or brain systems. They can also impede developmental processes, which is why most BPAs are banned in baby products. BPA and phthalates also leach into the environment and enter the human body through plastic pollutants. The main plastic pollutants are nurdles and microplastics. Nurdles are the raw bead-sized plastic pellets which come right out of the refinery. They pose a direct risk to production workers as they are directly exposed to BPA and phthalates in their production. They are also carelessly spilled into the environment during manufacturing and transport, and are often confused as food by wildlife. Microplastics occur at the end of the plastic life cycle and are defined as small pieces of fragmented plastic that are less than 5 millimeters wide. Similarly, these are also ingested by wildlife, and this poses a direct risk to humans as these BPA phthalates are known to bioaccumulate up the food chain. Bioaccumulation is the gradual accumulation of toxins throughout the food chain. As you can see here in this diagram, if the smallest fish species are eating the microplastics or knurls, they're directly exposing themselves to these endocrine disruptors. As the larger fish species eat these smaller fish species, the toxins carry up with them. Eventually, humans eat some of the largest fish species and are thus directly exposing themselves to the toxins that carry up the food chain and are exposed to these endocrine disruptors. As of now, there is no large-scale viable solution for microplastic removal. That being said, the bill will allocate funds for the microplastic pilot program in order to identify solutions for removal of microplastics as well as detection of microplastics. The bill also proposes a microfiber filtration program in the laundry system. It will mandate that all washing machines be equipped with these microfiber filtration systems. This is because 12% of all microplastics actually come from the laundry system when synthetic fibers break off the clothing. The bill also addresses inequities by ensuring that grants will be distributed to low-income communities for maintenance and installation of these filters. Lastly, we are going to look at the behavioral component of this bill. Historically, the burden of plastic waste has fallen onto the consumer. This bill introduces the idea of extended producer responsibility, otherwise known as EPR, and would result in a dramatic economic shift of plastic waste management from the consumer back onto the producer. This will be done through fines intended to regulate producers into minimizing single-use plastic, as well as designing more reusable, recyclable, and compostable plastic alternatives. EPR responsibilities will be carried out through the product stewardship plan. These plans will require every organization to set goals and stringent targets for recycling, composting, as well as other proper waste management targets. The bill itself sets a minimum benchmark of 80% of all covered products recycled, 90% of all beverage products recycled, as well as 70% of compostable plastic products composted by 2032. Now that we've discussed the plastics problem as a whole and the solutions proposed by the bill, let's look at the original plastic life cycle. As you can see, there's a major emphasis on extraction and refinement, as well as in its waste system, as 91% of all plastic waste ends up in the landfill. Our research has shown that if this bill were to be implemented, it would shift the plastic life cycle to make it become much more cyclical. As you can see here, there's a major emphasis on recycling, as well as composting and reuse options that will help extend the life of plastic itself. Most importantly, there will be a major reduction in the amount of plastic ending up in the landfill and waterways, as well as a major reduction in the extraction and refinement, because there will be a major reduction in the amount of single-use plastic being produced. As we look to the future, in the fall, we will begin researching the implementation of this bill, as well as how this new life cycle can help be a core aspect of shifting the US economy into a more circular economy. Thank you guys for listening, and I'd be happy to take any questions.
I have a question about the health impacts and how this bill specifically addresses those. Like, I get that extraction will be decreased, but it seems like these factories will still be producing plastic. It's just going to be not single-use plastic, and maybe there'll be recycling plants. Like, do you foresee a shift in the health impacts or a decrease in the health impacts just through those things, or are there other specific ways to address this?
Yeah, so through those things specifically, the bill mainly addresses single-use plastic production. And so by reducing the amount of single-use plastic, you're directly reducing the amount of fossil fuels necessary that need to be extracted. In doing so, you'll see refinement plants start to close, which will benefit the communities because these hazardous air pollutants won't be released into the air.
So it's mostly from the extraction, not from the factories that are like.
Yeah, extraction as well as like in the landfill itself and waste disposal.
Over here. You got it down first.
Yeah, so I have a question about the waste management. So you talked about how like the goal of the bill is to see more plastic recycled or more things that are compostable composted. But right now, a lot of times, there's like more things that could be recycled or composted, but aren't, because those systems are run by municipalities and like the government in those local areas hasn't invested in the correct recycling or composting facility. So like, does the bill have any funding for government to scale up their waste management? Because it seems very focused on producers, but producers don't actually control waste management. So if they like get their plastic wrap from consumers and want to recycle it, but like there's no recycling facility, they're still screwed.
Right, so the bill will create this national standardized labeling system, which as well as like creating a national standardized like recycling system. So the hope by doing this is that there won't be as many discrepancies between municipalities and between states themselves. Instead, there will be a standard of what types of resins can be sent into the recycling bin. And in doing so, this will help build up like infrastructure because around the United States, because more recycling plants will have the exact types of plastic they can actually recycle.
Great presentation. This might be an implementation question, but I'm curious as to which agencies will be responsible for educating people about the recycling changes and how they can increase their recycling behaviors. Is that something, if it's not managed well, that we won't see much behavior change?
Yeah, as of now, there is no agency that's doing that. So that will be in our research in the fall.
Take one more if there's a question.
For your presentation, Max. I have a question about the extended producer responsibility thing. So I like the idea that there'll be regulation to issues that have plastic. Does the Act do anything about increasing the abundance of alternative options to plastic? So obviously these companies going to see them in options. Will that be more available?
Yeah, so that's a great question. There's a lot of like these ideas of plastic alternatives like bioplastics and stuff like that. As of now, they're kind of a false promise to an extent, and none are widely available on a large scale solution or to be scaled up. So the idea of introducing this extended producer responsibility will be to incentivize these corporations to invest more money into research and development of various plastic products that are compostable, better recyclable, and can break down easier in the landfill.
Thank you very much. Go directly into our next briefing, which is which is a group that I advised on. Ready to go? Yeah. Okay. Wire them up.
Good. Everybody hear me? Yeah. Cool. Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Blake, and on behalf of my output team, comprised of Anna and Tunishka, wherever she is, we would like to welcome you to the final briefing for HR 806, the Clean Energy and Sustainability Accelerator Act. First, I would like to take a moment and thank Dr. Cohen for all your great support and guidance, and also the remaining team. Without this, none of this would be possible. Without their help, none of this would be possible. So for today's agenda, we'll be going through the accelerator overview. We'll be looking at why the bill is addressing reducing emissions. We'll look at the reduction strategy. We'll talk about guidelines and success measures for the bill, and then finally some next steps. So first, what is HR 806? So this bill establishes the Clean Energy Accelerator, which allocates $100 billion through the length of its charter into clean technology. And it does this through a variety of mechanisms noted here. And I'll touch on these in a little bit, but the one thing, if there's anything I can ask you guys to take away from this, is that the purpose of this bill is to increase investments into clean technology in order to reduce emissions. But why exactly do we care about reducing emissions? Well, emissions are the byproduct of combustion, and through this process, it releases CO2, which is a component of the emissions. And CO2, everyone's favorite molecule, is at an all-time high here. You can kind of see it on the graph. But we're looking at CO2 levels currently in the atmosphere that have not been noted for the past 800 million years. I mean, it's kind of incredible when you think about it. And what this leads to is a kind of an exacerbated greenhouse effect, right? So it speeds up the process of global warming. In addition, emissions also create human health risks and lead to biodiversity loss. Human health risks like increased bronchitis rates and asthma levels, which are respiratory illnesses, and also through processes like ocean acidification, that leads to the biodiversity loss that I just noted. But who exactly emits, right? And the sad part is, well, nearly every sector of our economy emits, right? With transportation leading the way at 29%, electricity following it at 25%, and industrial, residential, commercial, and agriculture. So when you look at this, the obvious question is, well, transportation's 29%. Why are we focused on clean energy? And the reason is the way we generate our electricity, the technology we use in that sector can be impacted and applied to all other sectors. Furthermore, as it stands today, unfortunately, regardless of economic assumptions, both high and lowish, we see that these two lines here, the two solid lines, emissions from the electricity sector are expected to increase, which is the complete opposite of the direction we need them to go. In addition, demand for electricity is only increasing. So this sector sits at a really interesting crossroads, right? And the way we invest our capital can decide whether or not electricity is harmful or helpful. But exactly how will the bill allocate these funds? So it does this through three mechanisms. First, it finances clean technology through direct federal investments. It also provides zero interest loans to municipalities or other organizations that are seeking to have a zero emission fleet or bolster their zero emission fleet infrastructure. It also helps mobilize private capital through public education. So the idea is by public outreach, they would stimulate demand for these products, thereby increasing, the reasons for investors to get involved. And then also through this, these private investors can target underfunded technologies. It would also create green banks, which are local entities that work on the ground close to where the projects are being deployed, partners with the federal government, and can provide fixed funding to these projects. But what kind of projects would they be investing in? So first are, there's kind of three buckets to look at: how we generate our energy, what we do with that energy, how we move it throughout the country, and then also carbon negative technology or carbon sequestration. So first, wind, solar, and geothermal create the renewable energy supply base. So these are the three kind of key technologies that we would want to invest in. Wind obviously generates wind force into electricity. Sunlight solar turns sunlight into electricity, and geothermal takes heat from the Earth's mantle and converts it into electricity and actually heats your home directly. But once you generate this, or how you generate this, can vary depending on where you are in the U.S. And there's a couple of different ways to generate power. First is a centralized methodology. And this is massive energy generation done in a single site and then distributed to end users. Think of nuclear power plants, hydroelectric dams, et cetera, et cetera. Or the complete opposite is what's known as a distributed. This is small scale energy generation done close to end users. Home solar, for instance, is probably the best example. And when you look at this, you're like, whoa, that's fantastic. Let's just deploy a bunch of distributed energy grids, call it a day, and we can all go home, right? The problem is renewable energy is inherently variable depending on where you are in the US. So you need a way to balance this. And that's where high voltage power lines come into play, another technology that needs to be invested in. These function as the methods to balance and distribute energies from just both centralized and distributed energy sources throughout the US. However, there's current regulatory complications. I think it's like 200 different agencies are currently involved in trying to get these power lines installed, and public acceptance is not where it needs to be. This is where the Clean Energy Accelerator can help. But once this power generated and distributed. You then need a way to store it just in case things go south, right? The sun stops shining. Actually, that would be really bad. The wind stops blowing, right? And this is where batteries come into play. They go, you can use them as part of the energy grid. You can put them in your electric vehicles, et cetera. But in terms of where we are today, their lifespan is only 2 to 10 years, and they only supply power for 4 to 6 hours. And if you're trying to power New York City and you only have 6 hours, that's not that long, right? So we got to bolster these numbers here. But then at the same time, you have to invest in what's known as carbon negative technology or carbon sequestration. So there's 3 main types: carbon capture and storage, biochar, direct air capture, et cetera. But the primary function, regardless of the type, is to capture CO2 emissions, either right at the source or after they've been emitted. However, this technology is extremely energy and capital intensive, and also there's very limited market incentives to keep the carbon stored. So we need to create ways to incentivize storing carbon and not putting it back into products. But then, because all this technology that I just mentioned, it's very different, right? So the bill also establishes some guidelines to consider for all types of investments. So while it creates green banks, finances clean technology, mobilizes private capital, et cetera, it sets a few guidelines. One is ecological integrity. So every project must consider the ecological integrity of the site in which it's being deployed. The bill earmarks 40% of the $100 billion for low-income community and communities of color. It also, every project must employ fair labor practices, so it has to pay a prevailing wage and also employ a certain number of union workers. And finally, every project must illustrate how it is directly impacting communal well-being, both natural and human communities. So how do we define success? So the amount of technology that is scaled and the emissions that are reduced will lead the way. So with this bill, we should notice and be able to measure an increased amount of renewable energy production. Right now, we're at only 20% in total for the US. That needs to drastically increase. And we should also notice increased grid integration technology deployment. With this, we will be able to measure, reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and reduce particulate matter. So we're at this really interesting point here in the US, right? And so this transition will happen. And what the point of this bill is to simply accelerate the US into a clean technology future. So coming next fall, we will look at the bill implementation, but that will be after a well-deserved break. Thanks, guys.
Yeah, I have a question. Is there a breakdown about how much of the funding will go towards sort of very nascent technologies where it's more being spent on developing them and understanding their potential, and then how much of the funding will go to sort of, technologies that we understand, but, just need to be scaled up. So like a good example might be like direct to air capture is very new. We don't have a fully scalable model, like the science being worked out versus like solar, we understand it's getting cheaper. This is just about getting solar panels on people's houses and that kind of stuff.
To answer your question directly, no, the bill does not specifically state this, like the percentage breakdown. I would say 2 things. One, that would probably be part of the bill implementation. We can kind of debate those percentages. But secondly, there's also, the bill does create like an advisory committee. So I would also imagine that committee would be very adamant on how you allocate those funds.
Great presentation. I was wondering, so for the investment in the renewable energy grid, considering the infrastructure bill passing yesterday, which is very recent news, so I don't expect this to be really well thought out. What do you imagine? I'm just saying, no, we really saw that coming. What do you imagine the role of this bill in creating a renewable energy grid would be if this bill sets out to provide funding and assuming that the infrastructure bill provides that funding?
I would view them as complementary. Yeah, so if we can take, what's 3 trillion? What was it?
It was 1 trillion for the bill, yes.
1 trillion, oh yeah, okay, 1 trillion, and then we can toss on another 100 billion with that. I think that would, we really need as much as we can get to deploy the assets as quickly as possible.
Very good.
Kind of going off of the infrastructure bill that passed, you spoke about the need to build more and update the high voltage power lines, but there's more and more debate about whether or not hyper localized like solar panels, but like community solar and sort of community localized power is actually a better way to sort of move forward with our grid in the future. Did you come across any research that spoke to that?
Yes, so it was a little complex to talk about in 10 minutes, but basically the function of needing high voltage power lines is directly correlated to battery technology and also efficiency of small power generation. So if you can increase efficiency in solar panels and increase efficiency in batteries, technically speaking, you could probably reduce your reliance on high voltage power lines. There are certain sectors of the economy like big industry that requires a ton of power, you probably couldn't get away from, but you wouldn't necessarily need the same amount of high voltage power lines if you can increase the efficiency of other tech. That makes sense? Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Cool. Very good. Cool.
5-minute break before we do our final. I like the graphics. I mean the use of animation. Yeah. So they just extended the match till the end of September. I mean, they could wait. I don't know why they keep doing this. Out of the budget. So much for our consumer reception. I think it's what you're doing with suicide. I mean, for the finance. It's a step back, and I mean, Barnett already took it, but they're minimally waiting for August 25th.
Right. Yeah.
It's gratuitous.
Yeah. What did you think of what's your vision on the end, Randy ending? Really? Huh? No, I know. No, doubling down here.
Okay, everybody can find your seats. Hear about the San Francisco Bay Restoration Act of 2021, advised by Mr. Absent. Dr. is going to provide us with this briefing.
Good morning, everybody. Today I'm going to be presenting to you H.R. 610, also known as the San Francisco Bay Restoration Act. Before I begin, I would like to thank my output team, Stephen, Aaron, and Daniela, as well as the whole restaurant team for the support to the output. I would also like to give a special thanks to Professor Absent for the support of this output and also during the entire semester. To preview what we will cover today, I would like to talk to you about the agenda. I will start by talking about the importance of the Bay, then I will talk about the environmental problems. I will try to describe the legislative history. I will talk about the environmental solutions. I will go through a case study, talk about the controversies, and then I will talk about measuring success to talk about this. Why is the San Francisco Bay important? We all know the San Francisco Bay for its impressive monuments such as the Golden Gate Bridge. It is also important to notice that this region is very economically advanced, especially in terms of GDP, making it the fourth largest economy in the US. When we dive deeper, we realize that this economic advancement was caused by the migration of immigrants that were seeing potential in the region. As a result, they created a hub of diverse economic sectors such as technology, finance, industrial facilities, shipping, and agriculture. Despite this economic advancement, we have seen a degradation of its ecological resources, especially the estuaries. To define an estuary, we are going to notice that an estuary is a location where waters of different properties connect and then they give home like to diverse plants and animal species. Estuaries are providing substantial ecosystem services to humans. So with all being said, why would a region like the San Francisco Bay not protect its natural resources? Before I answer this question, I would like to go through the environmental problems that are encountered at the Bay so that I can explain to you what led to these problems as well. Like I noted before, it was the migration of people that were looking to settle at the San Francisco Bay that created the ecological degradation. As the human population increased, it was crucial for people to accommodate their needs. As a result, they started to destroy the natural habitat and then creating ecological problems that can be summarized as anti-destruction, urban pollutants, sewage spill, disproportionate community impacts as well. By the end, it was crucial for the authorities to find a way to protect their natural habitat. And that's where we come to the San Francisco Bay Restoration Act. There have been many other legislations that were targeting ecological restoration. But the Federal Water Pollution Control Act of 1948 was the first of its kind to actually tackle water pollution. Afterwards came the Clean Water Act of 1972. That was one huge improvement of the Federal Water Pollution Control Act because it was addressing water pollutants and contaminants in water in a more substantial way. Afterwards, priority changed and it was needed to actually tackle ecological degradation. That's why in 2021, we had the San Francisco Bay Restoration Act that was introduced by Nancy Pelosi. The San Francisco Bay Restoration Act is focusing on establishing a Bay Program Office that would allocate funding to priority projects that will tackle ecological restoration. What are the solutions that are presented by the bill?
The solution can be summarized based on water pollution, habitat loss, invasive species, and climate change. The bill is trying to allocate funding in order to fight water pollution because we have been seeing that there was contaminants that were polluting water at the night. Habitat loss is planned to be tackled by providing funding in technology that would help to restore the habitat. Invasive species are also a problem. That's why the bill is providing funding for proper technology that will eliminate the invasive species and make the native species come back. Climate change is the one that makes everything worse. So it is crucial for the Bay to actually provide funding so we can invest in technologies that are going to help us prepare for the natural disaster that will come from climate change. Let's look at this case study. It is the Chesapeake Bay Restoration Program. As you know, the Chesapeake Bay is one of the largest estuary in the East Coast by the Mid-Atlantic region. That specific region does not necessarily have like the same problems as the San Francisco Bay because it wasn't really polluted because there were many people that were coming there. It was just that the natural resources were so appealing to other people that overexploitation of these natural resources created some environmental problems. An example of overexploitation was agricultural runoff and also too much fishing that were actually limiting the biodiversity at that area. So in 1979, Congress decided to actually enact the first type of legislation that was targeting restoration of this specific area. As a result, we have seen some things that did not work, but most of it worked because there were proper communication with the stakeholders. And it was also one example that what we're trying to do with the San Francisco Bay is not something new. It has been done in the past. Maybe it was not perfect, but providing funding to the right stakeholders can actually help to improve the San Francisco Bay Restoration Act. Now let's talk about controversy. The bill, people think that the bill is not perfect because the solutions can also create some other problems. When it comes to water pollution, we are afraid that the technology used to actually fight the contaminants is going to pollute other neighboring ecosystems. When it comes to habitat, to wetland restoration or tackling habitat loss, we also think that since we don't know what nature is going to respond to biological and physical control, we are afraid that also we are going to have to spend more, and also that it is going to pollute other neighboring. Now, when it comes to collaboration with stakeholders, we are afraid that there's going to be the issue of diversity and equity. It's going to be diversity and equity issue that we arise. And also, one thing that is very important is that the San Francisco Bay is attracting tourists all over the world. So all of these efforts might lead to disruption in social economic activity and also slow the economy in the long run. But still, the bill is actually defending itself by presenting some indicators of success. When it comes to water quality remediation, we are focusing on water quality standards to actually make sure that this bill is working. When it comes to habitat restoration, it is planned to have some type of report that actually shows that visually the wetland has been restored. Now, when it comes to invasive species, or the biggest indicator of success is going to be the introduction of native species. In terms of climate change, one of the main indicators of success is going to be readiness to adapt to any type of natural disaster that is going to arise from climate change. One of them is flooding. Now, when it comes to collaboration with different stakeholders, it is crucial to note that the bill is trying to incorporate the underrepresented groups in restoration efforts. Most of these measuring success activity has actually been following the input, process, output, and outcome framework. But our main thing about the San Francisco Bay Restoration Act is to actually ensure an equitable restoration of the bay. Thank you so much for listening to me. Next semester, we are going to talk about the implementation of this specific bill. I will be more than happy to answer your questions.
Such an inquisitive group. Okay, good.
Great presentation. When you were speaking about the case study of the Chesapeake Bay, that restoration, you said that it has a lot of applicability with the San Francisco Bay Restoration, but that it wasn't perfect. What are some of the things that were sort of learned through the Chesapeake Bay Restoration that can be improved upon with the San Francisco Bay Restoration?
Well, some of the things that were there from that was that when we actually use methods to reduce contaminants, that can actually work to slow, for example, the amount of nitrogen that we like introduce. But if someone in the team knows more about that, it will be good like to actually talk about it.
I had a great presentation. Staying on the case study, I want to ask what the comparison is between providing funding for the San Francisco Bay and what resources were available for restoration.
Well, when it comes to the Chesapeake Bay, the first thing that you have to notice that, like I said before, it wasn't truly that the Chesapeake Bay was as populated as the San Francisco Bay. Most of the problems were caused by, for example, agricultural runoff that was polluting the water over there. And the whole focus was to actually make sure that the biodiversity is restored in there. What the San Francisco Bay is going to tackle like water pollution, habitat loss, and invasive species. The Chesapeake Bay was just trying to make sure that all of this biodiversity was actually restored.
And I think, Jasmine, to your specific question about the funding, Chesapeake Bay has $450 million since its inception in federal funding, and this bill allocates about $1 million for San Francisco Bay, so it's much less. San Francisco Bay is a bit smaller, but it's still, comparatively speaking, a lot less than what it's currently been funded to by for Chesapeake Bay.
Yeah, when you were laying out the controversies, you mentioned that there might be an impact on economic development. And when I think of the Bay Area, I think of Google, right? Like, they're not a company that's using the Bay as a resource. So can you speak to like some specific examples of how these practices might impact businesses or the economy?
Sure. As you know, when it comes to habitat, there are some people that are coming to visit the San Francisco Bay because what I did not mention in the presentation was that it wasn't like diverse species, and some people are just coming to visit and try to take advantage of all this natural world. So I would say that one of the main examples that would actually like impact the economy, I think this would be tourism, because it's like you're doing restoration efforts, you're going to be proposing all of these things, and if people do not come, there is going to be some type of impact.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you. First, I want to congratulate all the groups and the briefers. This was a spectacular section, so let's give ourselves. I want to speak to pedagogy and the educational objectives of what we've just done, so that you're aware of what this was about, in addition to the substance of these issues. We're all focused on the substance, which is good. We want to be focused on substance. Substance is important. But in your career, you're going to find you're going to be dealing with many different problems, and they're going to be thrown at you, and you won't know where they're coming from or how they're defined. And so, just like on the first day of class, you were thrown a new bill, and then by the end of the day, you were working on it, and you were thinking about it. And so, what does that mean? I mean, what were we trying to do here? Trying to think about the process. How do I learn about a new issue, a new proposed solution, and get my arms around what I'm dealing with in the substance? So that's the first thing. You enter this with very little real information. You may know a little bit about the issue, but you're certainly far from ready to act professionally. But today, Each of these briefings is an example of high-quality professional analysis. How do we get there? Well, first, we work collaboratively. We work as a group. Each of these problems is technologically complex, scientifically complex, organizationally complex. No single discipline works here. You need ecology, engineering, environmental science, policy analysis, management, operations research, knowledge of law, state and local government, management itself, all together. And many of the questions we're asking come from these different disciplines. And no single person can do this alone. And so every time I worked through my career on these kinds of problems, and I'm sure my colleagues on the faculty will say the same thing, you bring together a lot of different expertise. So how do you get the most out of those groups? And what I saw here is evidence of people working together, helping each other, being cooperative, being supportive, trying not so much to compete to get the right answer first, it's not like a game show, but actually trying to figure out how do we address these issues and being generous with each other, and the importance of listening and respect and participation is evident. You don't get to these kinds of presentations without that process. I'm not saying it's perfect, I'm sure none of these things are perfect, but that's how you get from here to there. And the point here is not to become an expert in San Francisco Bay or energy, but become an expert in the process, so that when the new problem gets thrown at you, you're ready with, I gotta get a group of people together that know a little bit about the different disciplines. I gotta think about a work plan. I've got to move along the process so we get from here to there and do it with some speed. And that's really what we did. And so I want you to be self-conscious about that. That's one of the objectives of the workshop, is not to make you an expert in the subject matter, but to make you an expert in the process of being a professional, doing this kind of collaborative problem solving. And the evidence that it works is the last hour and a half. These were great presentations. I enjoyed all of them. I learned from all of them. And everybody in the room, I hope you also learned from it. And so this is one of the advantages of the mission of trying to save the planet, is we've got a lot to learn. And so it's always very exciting when you see new knowledge being displayed, nuances. I mean, this issue that my group was talking about the high voltage lines, you know, I learned about earlier this year from my colleague Doug, well, because they're building these in China. And I was trying to understand why. And so I heard about it again. So in any case, congratulations on a great workshop. Looking forward to reading your final reports. And you've now earned an extra half hour to yourself. So congratulations.